My name is Beth Laing, and I've had kind of three careers. And so if I were listening to me, I would be like, why should I listen to you? So I thought I would tell you why I have a little credibility here. So my first career was really in online journalism, and I worked for a bunch of different newspaper companies as they were starting to go online. And so I ran kind of that unit for several different newspapers. And then I had a couple of kids and ended up working part-time in the nonprofit sector as a project manager for about 9 years. And then when my kids got older, I realized that it was time for me to figure out what I was going to do next. And so I went to a coding boot camp called General Assembly. And after finishing that, I started working at CNN, Turner, Warner Media, whatever it's called now. And I did that for a little over 3 years. And recently, like 4 months ago, I took a job as an engineering manager at a company called CallRail, which is in Atlanta. So that's my professional piece. The other half of my life is I'm also very involved in the community. So I'm one of the co-directors for Women Who Code Atlanta, which is a pretty big active chapter for Women Who Code, which is a global organization that helps women up-level their skills. So we're not about bringing people into technology as much as we are about bringing people up in technology. I also am one of the so as that, we started a conference called We Rise in Atlanta, which we ran for 2 years. And starting this year, we started a new conference separate from Women Who Code called Refactor.tech. And that is really all about highlighting marginalized and underrepresented people in technology. So we have people, it's a conference of about 500 people, and it's 2 days plus a workshop day. It's pretty awesome. You should check it out. So that's kind of some of the stuff I do. I'm also a parent and things like that. So I feel like I mentioned being a parent because I think it is super helpful in learning how to be a good manager of your time and helps you prioritize. So I'm not saying you should become a parent so you can do that. I'm just saying it helps a lot. So that's a little bit about me. So congratulations. Getting a job is a big process. I know, having gone through a boot camp myself and being involved in Women Who Code and other things like that, I get hit up a lot, whether it's on Slack, on Twitter, wherever, in person, and asked about, well, how do you get a job? And so I know that process is really hard, and people have to go different routes depending on what your credentials are, what your experience is. So it's not an easy path. So having a job is awesome. But it's kind of funny because we spend all this, so I equate it, of course, with like being pregnant. You're pregnant for 9 months and then you have this kid and you're like, yes, I'm done. But no, you're not, because you got the next 18 years. The next 18 years are what really is the long haul. So that's kind of what it's like, right? You work so hard to get this job, you finally got it, you're super excited, but hopefully you're going to be in that job for a while. So it's probably worth taking some time to make sure you're ready. Plus, I just like these little unicorn guys. So this is kind of an agenda of what we're going to talk about today. Making a plan. Part of that is making good impression. Part of it is being ready because you passed all those horrible interviews and whiteboarding and whatever challenges you had to do. But that's not the end, that's the beginning. People are important pretty much, even if you're working remote, you probably have interactions, whether it's via Slack or stand-ups that are over Hangout or whatever you're doing. And then how do you just level up? So you started your job, but how do you get good at it? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So first, I am a big believer in making a plan. If you saw my house, you might not believe that because it doesn't look very organized, but I do believe in planning. So first of all, you probably did some research about where you were interviewing, but you might have been interviewing like 27 places. So now it's time to focus and re-up your knowledge about wherever you are working. So is it a big company? Is it a small company? It might be in the news. Everybody's on social media. So you definitely want to make sure you're following them. You know what's going on. Do they have any big product changes? Do they have any big company changes? Like, oh, when I worked for Turner, a little merger happened, and then it didn't happen, and then it did, and it was really long and horrible. But you kind of needed to know that if you came in to interview and you had no idea that there was this DOJ contentious fight going on, you kind of sounded like Not very smart. So kind of know what's going on. The other thing, LinkedIn is still, in my opinion, invaluable, because if you don't know somebody at that company, you probably know somebody who does. And being able to, I've had people who just said, hey, I'm interviewing at this company, could I meet you for coffee? Because when I worked at Turner, which is a big company, that happened more frequently. But if you're interviewing, or if you're about to start, it's great to go ahead and get to know somebody. Even if you're not working with them, you're going to just get to know them a little bit and kind of get the lay of the land, which is very helpful. There are things that you should know before you go for your first day, like, I don't know, where you should park, what time you should show up, who you should report to, things like that. So if you haven't already gotten an email or an agenda for that, it's very normal for you to send an email to whoever your contact is and ask these questions, because not knowing when to show up can be horrible. People have shown up at 8 o'clock and really they don't start till 10, and that's aggravating too for the people who are like, I don't know what to do with you. So it's good to ask these questions ahead of time. It just makes you a little bit more polished and ready. Also a lot less stressful, because there's nothing like sitting in a lobby for 2 hours. And then what to bring. Typically, for almost any job, you're going to get a computer, unless you're doing a contract job, and then maybe you need to bring your own computer, things like that. But it might be that you need to bring your ID, your social security card, your picture ID, all these things. One of the things that I always forget is you're going to have to sign up for benefits and things. So kind of thinking about, your kids' social security numbers, if they're on there, things like that. So if you just have all that with you, super helpful. I know people should not carry that in their phone, just social security number. So having that list and just having it all ready. I like to have these little zip up like envelopes that you can just stick everything in and then zip it up, and then you look super organized. One of the other things I wanted to mention as far as research is, if you know what tech stack you're going to be working in, it's really good to see if there are updates. If you're working for a large company, they're probably not going to be on the most recent version of Node or whatever framework or whatever, but you should kind of know what's trending, because it might be something that becomes relevant, like deprecation might be an issue. So the more intelligent you are, the more you can ask good questions or bring up good things in conversation. Not that you should walk in and be like, I know everything, but it's helpful to go in and have some idea of what's going on in that tech stack. Also, industry trends. If you're working, for example, in the media industry, probably a good idea to know kind of who the big players are, who is owned by who, which is sometimes hard to keep up with. If you're working in telecom, things like that. So just understanding what's happening in that industry. Also, if your company is expanding into different lines of business, things like that. So even though you're not making product decisions for the company, it's probably a good idea for you to have some idea what the company does. I think that if you go out to a bar and you sit next to somebody and they say, hey, who do you work for? And you tell them, and they say, what do? You should be able to answer that question. Maybe not day one, but pretty soon after. So one of the things that sometimes happens is there's not a computer for you yet, especially at a large company, because they put requests in, they go to some department, they get approved by somebody, they may arrive in time, they may not arrive in time. So my recommendation is that you bring a notebook and a pencil, so that you can write things down, because it's real. I mean, a lot of the time you can write things down in your phone, but sometimes it's hard to go find it again. If you're super organized on your phone, that's great. I realize that there's an age divide, and if you're 15, then you write everything in your phone. But I like to have it, there's an act of writing on paper that helps it codify in your head too. So I also think it's helpful as you're going through a lot of your first couple of days or weeks for you to just jot down questions, because they might get answered later. Then you can go back and kind of be like, oh, no, I know this, I don't have to ask this. But it's kind of a whittling down of what you don't know, and also identification of what you know you don't know. I also highly, highly recommend that you have in case your computer is there, there's going to be a setup that you'll have, but there's also some tools that you probably have become super accustomed to using, and you want to go ahead and install those. I mean, Postman comes to mind. I don't really know anybody that doesn't use Postman. I like Jeeves because it helps me find things more easily, but people have their own, you get used to your shortcutty stuff on your computer, and then you're like, oh, this is my work computer, now I can't do anything. So first impressions, you never have a second chance to make a first impression, so they're kind of important. So what do you wear? So it's funny because I can remember back in the day when you had an interview and you wore a suit. It's just how it was, right? If anybody walked in now in a suit, people would be like, I'm not sure, I don't know. And a guy that I used to work with is like, well, people don't come in a suit. I'm like, are you wearing jeans and a t-shirt every day? You really expect somebody's going to show up in a suit? I don't think that's realistic. So you probably dressed appropriately for your interview because you got hired. So on your first day, you should dress a click above. So most offices are pretty casual. If it's a casual office, maybe instead of a t-shirt, you wear a collared shirt the first day. Maybe you don't wear tennis shoes. Maybe you wear some nice leather shoes. Just a little bit nicer, just to show that because this is the first day you're going to meet a lot of people, so you kind of want to dress your best in something that you feel confident in. Feeling confident is super important. But what you wear is only part of your first impression. So making sure that you have good posture, that you're standing up straight, putting your shoulders back, because if you're slouching over, then number one, you look like you're very uncomfortable, you don't look very confident. Making eye contact with people when you meet them, having a good firm handshake is really important. There's nothing worse, and women are the worst at this, at having a really gentle handshake that just shows no strength there. So verbally confirming when somebody says something to you, because it's very annoying to say like, hi, good morning, how are you? And have somebody not answer you in some way. Don't tell them your whole story, and also just make sure that you take a deep breath and you relax. So this is a really good opportunity for you to study up on your skills. I cannot express how important it is to have good Git skills. And I feel like knowing how to use Git from the command line is really important. If you don't know how to use command line Git, you will never understand using the tools. I still use command line Git. So I have some links in here that I will put up. I'll put the slides up, but this is a simple guide to Git. And then this is this Git kata, just to become really good at Git. And I cannot overemphasize how important it is. I have really wanted to do a workshop with Women Who Code for a long time called Git Oh Shit, because I think it's great, because you're like, I know how to use Git. I can pull, I can push, I can make a branch. But it's like, when things go wrong, what do you do? And that's the kind of stuff that you don't have to be an expert at, but you have to have some idea. Like, you should be able to ask, should I rebase here? How do you handle this? So cannot say that enough. Using command line tools is really important. We don't use them a lot because mostly we're in the code and we're writing in your editor. But to set up your computer, you're going to need to use your command line. Your command line is just an awesome shortcut tool. A lot of people skimp on that. I will say, as somebody in a boot camp, literally we went in and they were like, oh, type this command, do, and it just like magic happened and the whole computer was set up and you were all good to go. So I had no idea what to do. So it was a little bit painful. But I like this introduction because it starts from what is command line, and it also goes into Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. So whatever you're using, I feel like you should be able to use command line whatever computer you're on. So I'm not saying these are the end-all be-all things, but it's a good place to start. Oh, I cannot talk about how important reading code is. Almost any time that you're working, you're going to be working with somebody. So even if you are working on a greenfield project where you're starting something new, you're still going to have to do code review for somebody else. You're still going to have to read what somebody did and understand what happened. The majority of people will at some point work on a project that is existing and horrible, and somebody wrote it 5 years ago and they hate themselves now for what they wrote, but you still have to read it and figure out how to refactor it or extend it. So if you can't read it, it's really hard to do that. So reading code is something that is so emphasized as a skill to have. When you go to a boot camp or when you are in a college program, everything that you're building is new. You almost never have to go back and fix it, right? You're just like, hey, it's done. I just turned it in. Great. I'm good to go. Moving on to the next thing. That's not real life. Real life is a lot about reading code. And again, tools like Postman and Charles, depending on what you're doing, are super, super helpful. So, and then VS Studio Code has become super popular, and for good reason. So I like this because I feel like it goes through a bunch of, it starts from I know nothing, which I like, and just goes through kind of how to really make the most of your IDE. And then if you know what your tech stack is, you should spend a little bit of time making sure you know what Angular's doing now, or what Vue's doing now, or whatever, Gatsby, whatever you're going to be using, or think you might be using. Although I will say sometimes you get there and they're like, hey, guess what? You're going to start doing Objective-C. Well, not anymore. But I have a friend who started as the first iOS developer at a company, and she was very excited. She had worked on the app for the Women Who Code We Rise conference, and so through that had met some people and got this job as an iOS developer. And so she walked in the first day, and she sits down, and they had a contractor who had built their app, and so she was going to be revising it. And she pulls it up, and she's like, it's all Objective-C. So her first project was to convert it from Objective-C to Swift. So that was a surprise. So people are part of your job. I'm going to focus more on being in the office, although if you're remote, it's a little bit different. I'm happy that most offices have some level of remote policy, even if it's not every day. But even if you are remote, you need to know who's on your team, right? And that may be something you didn't find out when you interviewed and were offered the job. So I think it's a good thing to ask before you actually start, but definitely in your first day, you want to meet your teammates. So what are the processes that the team follows? For example, are you using Jira? Are you using target process? What tools do you use? Do you have sprints? Are you Kanban? All these things. What are regular meetings that you should just go ahead and have on your calendar? Some organizations are super organized and they already have your calendar set up. Some organizations aren't, and you just have to set your calendar up yourself. I'm a big believer in setting up reminders because I need that, because I will just keep going until my little thing pings and tells me I have to be somewhere else. What tools do you use that are kind of a baseline? Do people communicate in their PRs? Or do they communicate in your target process or whatever you're using for managing? Asana, just knowing what the tools are. Also, it sounds really basic, but what does success look like? So if you are working at a company and let's say that you do Scrum and you do 2-week sprints, is there an expectation that you will finish all of your stories in those 2 weeks? Is something being in code review or QA done? What does done mean? What's the responsibility of those finishing steps? For example, sometimes it's up to the developer to push that story through, and for me to say, hey, QA person, are you finished? Because I need to make sure that product looks at it before it goes into master and then into production, and then by the way, then it's still my job to smoke test it in production. So again, not something that you would know coming in, but these are all questions that you should ask or figure out through the explanation of what the process is. So listening to people is super important. It's ironic because I'm talking, but there's kind of a rough 70-30 rule, which says that you should listen 70% of the time and talk 30% of the time. I mean, it's good to have kind of a rule of thumb. It's certainly not, not a law. I also think it's really good to make sure that you have one-on-one time with people that you're going to be working with closely, whether that's pairing on something, go grab a cup of coffee, get to relate to people. It's really important that you establish some baseline so that if something weird is going on and they're acting funny, you kind of know that that's not normal, and you can see if there's something going on temporarily or whatever, but getting to make those relationships strong is important. So this is the whole work process question as far as the work increments. And definition of done is really interesting because in some cases you actually can't push things to production. So that should, like, you need to push back as a member of a development team on that, to say, like, I can't push to production, that's not in my control, so I can't make that my definition of done. You need to understand, is the QA people process part of your team, or is that something that you throw over to another team? How does that work? These are all things that are questions that you should be asking if it doesn't become clear as you're getting onboarded, because it's important for you to understand so that you know when to push and when to wait. And even if you can't deploy, you need to understand how deployment works. And you need to understand, does it happen once a day? Does it happen multiple times a day? Does it happen once a week? Do I need to look at things in development? Do I need to look at things in a staging environment? So understanding all those pieces and what that process looks like. Some organizations are really awesome and have an onboarding process that goes through this, and others are just get started and ask a lot of questions. So you should be ready either way. So I'm a big believer, like I said, in having a notebook. And I think it's important. You're going to meet some people that you're going to see every day, and then you're going to meet some people that you're going to see less frequently. And it's important. I am horrible with names, which people don't know because I work really hard at it. And so one of the things I do is just write down people's names and little things about them, like went to Georgia Tech, lives in Decatur, has a dog, not particularly work relevant things, but just trigger things for me. And then I try to figure out, like, on this team, works on this project, hates Python, just whatever, little things. So you don't have to write them down. You can just put them in. There are great managers for that, but I like writing them down. So I also will draw out an org chart, even if it's not right. Some organizations have it. It took me like 4 months to find it when I was at Turner, but I had already kind of written down like my version, like, oh, here's my manager. My manager reports to this person. This person's over here in some cloud over here. I don't know, but I know that in order for anything to get changed, she has to approve it, just so that you kind of get to know who the key people are. Because it might not be apparent from an org chart that is company made, designed, because there might be somebody who has to approve any changes that doesn't even show up anywhere near you. So that's why I'm a big fan of, like, making your own version of the org chart, people you care about, and then just highlighting people who you definitely want to influence. So now you're actually at work. Yay. So sometimes there will be a formal training process, and sometimes there won't be. Sometimes you'll get there and there will be an official, like, cohort of everybody starting that day that they'll give you the lay of the land. So that just depends on what your company is, how big it is, things like that. There's also probably some level of security. It might be that you get a name badge with your picture on it. It might be that you get an access card. So there's physical access, and then there's also access and permissions to things like the code base and to looking at things on the application and all that kind of stuff. It's really hard to do your job without these things. So hopefully you're getting that done on day one. A lot of companies have different time tracking systems. Sometimes it'll be tied to a project and you'll have to have an accounting code, and you're going to have to ask the person next to you what you're supposed to do. Sometimes if you started in a temp to perm, like you're a 3-month contract employee, but you're working on site, you'll have like 3 systems you have to put your time in. You should know this early, because trying to do it retroactively is awful. So getting to know where all the code lives and things like that is important, all the different environments, and also what access you have in different environments is important. Now almost every company has a lot of stuff in the cloud, so you're going to have your cloud set up and all that. And also understanding where the documentation is. Documentation is your best friend. I think it's really good to start with the README. Sometimes stuff is there, sometimes it's not, sometimes there's a link there. But usually there's some kind of documentation repository. The tricky part is sometimes there's more than one and nobody's updating that one that you found. So good thing to find out. We just found out that we have all this documentation for our organization, not the development part, but like the marketing and sales, and that nobody's using all this documentation that everybody's been updating. So it's good to know that. So got your credentials done, you met everybody, your computer's set up, your access is set up, you're good to go. So the first thing that you need to do is step back and ask for a demo of the product or products that you're going to be working on. Because if you don't know what you're building, it's going to be hard to make decisions correctly. And it sounds like you should just be able to jump right into the code base and start typing away, but if you don't know what you're doing, it's really hard. Understanding who your customer is. I've spent a lot of my career in software development where my customers are all internal. So the people who saw CNN.com, not that I didn't care about them, I care about them a lot, but they were one step removed. The stuff that I was working on was helping put the news on the TV. So the people I cared about were the people in the newsroom, because those were the people using the tools that I was building. So understanding who your customer and user is. So my old manager used to say that writing code is the easiest part of what we do, and figuring out what code we need to write is the real tricky part. So if you never understand who you're writing for, it's hard to get that part right. Again, I think this is really underrated. So I think it's really good to have a notebook of projects. And you can write this down, you can have a doc, whatever works for you. But understanding, so it might be that you got hired and you're working on this project, but in a couple of weeks or months, something may change and you have an opportunity or you're voluntold that you're working on this other project. So if you can keep track of kind of what's going on and how they're interrelated, it will serve you well down the road. And again, I believe in being ready for the long term. Especially if you're being hired in at a more senior level, there are certain expectations of performance that may or may not be verbalized to you or written or anything. So one of the things that, if you are starting out, it's worth taking a little bit of time up front so you can be better in the long term. What's the expected time for you to have your first PR is not unreasonable to ask. I don't know that anybody can answer it, but if I'm hiring somebody who's a senior engineer, it's a lot shorter than somebody that's a mid or junior engineer. So being cognizant of what level you're being hired in at is important for you to gauge kind of your expectations. I also like to make diagrams, and I know there are some awesome programs for that, but diagramming kind of the flow of data and understanding that is really important. Knowing what databases you're using, knowing who's using those. So getting into the code is obviously what we've been waiting for. So it's important to have an inventory of the different, it might be that you have a monolithic code base, it might be that you have a bunch of smaller repos, but understanding what that looks like, right? And understanding where you're spending most of your time. So again, learning how to read code. So as I mentioned, I'm a newish engineering manager, and so I have an architect who's awesome and brilliant, and everybody wants a piece of him. So we had this requirement from the product team of doing a filter. And so I'm like, I'm gonna go look at the code, I'm gonna see what's happening. I'm gonna be super efficient here. So I went and found the line in the code, and they wanted to check for something that either A or B was happening. If A or B was happening, then don't do something. Okay, so I find the line in the code and it's an and. I'm like, oh, we're doing this wrong. So I copy this line of code, and I comment on it in the PR, and I send this email to product and to the architect. I'm like, oh, I think we're doing this and we should be doing this. I was wrong. I was wrong because it was a delete if, but I didn't read the whole piece of code, no, because I was just finding that one piece of code. If I had taken the time and listened to my own advice and read the code, read the code and followed the flow, I would not have made that mistake. So I was being very earnest, but it wasn't helpful. So now next time I will do a better job. Running local is really important. Sometimes it's painful because if you have a bunch of stuff running in the cloud and things like that, you might be limited in what you can do, but it is so worth the investment of time to figure out and make sure that you're set up to run local. It's really hard to test things that are in the cloud if you can't run local and see what your console errors are. So cannot stress that enough. So what are the standards for your company? Linting standards, code styles, things like that are important to understand. Some companies have I set up so upon deploy, your specs all have to pass. All of that is automated, which is great. But it also kind of stinks to be the new engineer whose stuff doesn't go through because it keeps failing. But if you don't know about linting standards, if you don't know about some of these things, then you're not going to do them. So ask the questions up front about what the requirements are, what needs to happen. And then understanding tests. For example, is there a minimum code coverage for tests? Are there standards for what things get tested, what things don't? What frameworks are you using? There are a lot of tools out there that will measure your code coverage. There are a lot of tools out there that somebody probably has configured from a management standpoint that will tell you how long it takes you to open a PR, how many review cycles you have for your PR, things like that. If these things are being measured, I think you should know that if that's a measure of success, right? Like if you don't know that review cycles are a measure and that if you have too many, it's going to get flagged, then you would have a bunch of whip PRs not knowing that if you have too many, it would be a negative. Whether it really is a negative or not, it's just something that's being measured and you should be aware of it. So understanding what things are being measured is really important. So understanding your Git flow is really important. So you've got a workflow, you get a story, you open a PR, you probably have a branch. What's the naming convention for your branches? There's probably a standard. You put it up, you send it to code review. So some places code review is like, I think I'm going to take this approach. Does this make sense? Can somebody look at this? Other places code review is, I think this is perfect. Can you just confirm that it's perfect? So understanding the purpose of code review is really important. What context needs to go into that code review, into your PR for code review? How do you tag it? Who do you tag for code review? All these things are good to know. What is the merge process? Who merges things into master? Do you merge? Do you rebase? Again, understanding what the conventions are that are followed. I promise that if you're working in an organization with more than one person, there's got to be a convention for doing these things or you're going to just hate life. And also, what should your commit messages be? How much detail do you put in? Do you have to reference a certain story or anything like that? So most places have thought for a minute about the best way to do this so that's trackable and so you can have a good Git log to follow. Understanding how you're tracking things is important. Who moves things? So if I'm a developer and I've put my PR up for code review and it's past code review, is it my job to tell QA that it's time to look at it? Is it the person who did code review? How does it get moved on the board? Does it only get moved in Git, either GitHub or GitLab or whatever, or is it moved in some other place? So understanding that, is there documentation that needs to go along with things before it's done? This goes back to your definition of done. Is documentation part of that definition of done? So I heard John Mills, I don't know if anybody knows, he's one of the organizers for KCDC. I heard him give a talk and he said, and it just stuck in my head, he said, the difference between a mid-level developer and a senior developer is that a senior asks questions. And I was like, that's kind of cool, right? So I think sometimes people, especially the less experience you have, the less inclined you are to ask questions because people see questions as a sign of admitting you don't know something. Guess what? You don't know. So it's important not to just ask a question like, oh, how do I do this? I mean, you should do some research first, right? You should ask, so the goal is to ask intelligent questions. Your question should be specific. You should have looked it up. You should have maybe tried something before you asked a question so that you're coming in with, here's what I tried, it didn't do this, what do I need to make this happen? You need to know what you're trying to find out. You shouldn't ask the same question again. I mean, if you didn't understand the answer, that's one thing, but you shouldn't be asking the same question over and over again. That shows that you're not progressing. So if your questions are getting better, that's good. I think you owe it to yourself and to the person who's taking time to work with you and answer your question to actually document what you learned And so if somebody takes the time to answer you, it's really great if you can just throw up a wiki page or whatever and say, hey, here's what I think you said and I tried. Can you just look at this and make sure I got it right? And then you're just building in for future people that they can look that up, which is hugely appreciated. So how do you get to be productive? A lot of the time, as somebody eases in, you'll get a chance to pick up maybe a smaller load, like pick up 1 or 2 stories. Some teams will take a story and task it out where different people do different parts of the story. Some places, kind of each person picks up a story. You kind of go off and work on your story, holler if you need help, come back for code review. So depending on how the organization works, but ideally, at some point, a little bit in, depending on your level, you should be picking up a body of work. So it's really important that you're new. So there are probably things that are unsaid. There are probably things everybody else knows about what a deliverable is and about what the requirements are that are not built into that story. So you need to make sure you're clear. And if that means stopping during planning and saying, hey, let me just make sure I understand for this, if I'm adding this drop down, it needs to do this and this. Is that anything else it needs to do? I mean, make sure that and maybe I can talk to the product manager after planning so everybody doesn't have to sit through this. That's fine too, but make sure that it's acknowledged that you do not know what you do not know and somebody needs to tell you so you can do it right. Set a time limit on yourself. Like, do not sit there for 2 days banging your head against the computer, unable to do something because there's just a piece that is missing. So make sure that you're not setting yourself up to just hate life and not get it done because you were unwilling to ask for help. And hopefully you get your first PR and you can celebrate that. Even if, so when I first started at CNN, I had somebody who had been there for, I don't know, about 4 months. And so it was probably my second week. And so she had her first PR and we were doing code review. So we put it up on this big screen and we're all sitting around and we're looking at it. And she's like, so here's what I did. And one of the other people on the team who's very, very smart and super nice, but just very direct, was like, I don't think that's right. And just shredded it. And I was like, I was gonna cry for her. And so I waited till later to cry, but it was scary, it was intimidating, but at the end of the day, I was so impressed because she just kind of took a deep breath and she's like, okay, this is just gonna make me better. And so just being able to separate that, I'm not my code, is sometimes important.
Peer, you mean like peer review or performance review?
Pardon?
Peer stands for peer review or performance review?
This was
No, peer.
pull request.
Pull request.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so your first pull request. Yeah, we didn't make it to a performance review yet.
Okay.
Hopefully, we're doing some code first.
Yeah, because earlier also you mentioned PR because that is the context of performance review.
Yes, I did not think about that. I'm sorry. So, yay. So I know this is very broad, and I know it's also kind of aimed at people who are maybe getting into their early jobs, but I'm happy to answer questions that are more specific to different levels and things like that.
And after joining, suppose if you find that this is not your area of interest where you wanted to work, and you still sense some other project might have some other better interest than what you are trying to slog here.
So,
is it a good idea to just ask the corresponding managers, or you want to tell your manager first?
So that all depends. So I think that if you like the company, so the question is really about, so you're in your job, but you don't love it. But there's something else that's interesting. So if you're in a company that you like, that's a great opportunity. A lot of large companies will have a policy that you can't move within the company for a year or something like that. So it's probably good to know what that policy is, but you're already in. So if you can find people to talk to and just like go have an informational coffee or go for a walk, that's a super way to start to get to know what's happening and then be able to say, hey, if you have an opening, I'm super interested, can you let me know? I have somebody on one of my teams right now who I don't think really wants to be a developer, And so we've been talking about that a lot. So he wants to explore some other areas. And so I'm like, look, you're at this company. It's a great company. Here's somebody who does what you are interested in. Go talk to him. I'm happy to facilitate that. I'm happy to let you do it, whatever you, I mean, I'm in a weird situation because he's been there a lot longer than I have. So I'm like, I could introduce you, except you already know each other. So normally I would be more proactive at setting that up, but it feels weird to do that in this case.
Yeah, because I've been into different roles, even being engaged as a kind of a manager to recruit some people. We have spent so much of time in recruiting this guy, and suddenly he comes in, and after a couple of months, he said, "No, I'm not interested. I want to do that job and this job." And probably most of the managers may not be willing to relinquish him actually.
Yeah.
Release him also.
Yeah, that is really hard. And that
it's all again the manager's decision, like whether to keep him with unsatisfied work or just moving on, then look out for something else.
and I think that's a huge problem. But I also think as a manager, you kind of look at that person and you're like, okay, if I don't help you, if I don't create a path for you to get to something you want to do, you're going to leave anyway. So if I want you that badly, you're probably pretty good. So at some point, you know, how do you make it so that you still get some value, because you did spend all this time recruiting them? How do you get some value out of this person, and at the same time keep them within the organization as much as possible, so at least you organizationally are benefiting? But that's really hard. And yeah,
I mean, the flip side is like the persons, those who are already having experience, we don't want to lose them because of their product knowledge or any business knowledge. So we want to retain them also. Then obviously that's also a different scenario.
yes.
Not only for the new ones who joined just recently.
I think, and I see that in so many places. There's the single source dependency, where there's one person who knows how to do, well, there's certain people who know how to do things, but one person knows how to do this, one person knows how to do that, and if they're on vacation, like, you can kind of hobble along for a week, but if they left, you would be like, I don't know what we're going to do. And
with the major problems with the legacy code actually, like,
yes,
big difficulties we face most of the times.
yes.
People, those who are veterans more than 30 years or something, they just left. That's a big
I know, because nobody wants to go learn how to work with this legacy code because it's ugly and hideous.
Documentation may not help all the time actually, because some people has to understand the document first.
And yeah, and that's, yeah, it's an unfortunate situation to be in, but it's hard to get out of. Very hard to get out of. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So one thing you touched on real quick was the eye contact. I came from the military, right out of the military, came into a coding position as a DevOps engineer, and it was a complete flip of personality traits. And I'm told that I get too much eye contact in my first 2 months of that, which is normal in the military, but not normal in the coding industry.
Wow.
Right? So what is your experience in the industry when it comes to personality traits such as eye contact and communication, and how it's very specific to this industry?
I would say if it were 10 years ago, it would be different. I think now there's a level of people contact that's required that's much higher than it used to be. It used to be you could just go like sit in your little desk, you know, with almost like you could just put a chair in the doorway and nobody would talk to you, and that was fine as long as you produced good code. Nobody really cared about interacting. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that using agile has changed the dynamic so much, and there's still organizations that follow that very strict definition that it's probably different in. But I think now people, that surprises me, frankly, too much eye contact. I don't know, maybe too much direct eye contact, and maybe looking at different people from time to time is better, and maybe it makes people feel too on the spot. But I think I've mostly had pretty good eye contact. So
I do agree with him actually, because I belong to CSX. We recruit a lot of veterans from the military and all. So they have different kinds of personalities because they've been groomed to that level so that they'll be more disciplined and very well structured and all. But when you do something like this kind of Scrum technology based, everything is random and you keep doing a lot of sprints and trials and everything. So they feel like, okay, it's something not going right or kind of stuff initially to begin with. And they get adapted to it to some extent. Over a period of time, probably you may need to have some more HR sessions with them and saying that, okay, this is how the industry works actually.
Yeah,
It's a kind of a disconnect between the previous career versus the current career.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff.
yeah, that is really interesting though. And I have worked with some people who are ex-military, who definitely had some personality quirks, but that wasn't one of them. They definitely had some quirks though.
Might be extra jarring in our industry just because like nerds that spend a lot of screen time and not a whole lot of human time. Like don't have the same
Or a bunch of introverts, right? And then someone's chompy.
I was told it comes off, even the person that I interviewed with, the director, said it came off as intimidating.
That's
I intimidated the person that was going to be hiring me. So,
Wow.
I had to adjust the way that I presented myself to people, which is fairly done now, but it's a continual thing. It probably goes with any industry. You go into another industry completely, and you have different people with different personality traits with different requirements. So,
Yeah, especially like
Yeah.
you said, you already worked in the media industry. People who are coming from media to the software industry, they're more chatterboxes. So because we wanted to limit them, obviously.
That-
there's a different confidence level in different aspects.
That's very true. I think it's very telling that now you can order a quiet Uber.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess there's definitely some truth to that. Some people are like, and I think that's really an important thing to get to know about the people you're working with. Like, pretty much if you walk up and somebody has big headphones on and they're staring at their screen, you should not interrupt them. I mean, that's like a do not disturb sign. But where I used to work, people who'd been there for a long time could contact switch like this. Like you could just go and say, hey, you remember this thing that you wrote like 10 years ago? Is it? And they would be like, oh yes. And I was like, oh my God, you people are insane. I don't know how you do this. And it was just a generally accepted thing that you pretty much could go ask somebody, unless they were really deep down into it, you could interrupt somebody. Where I work now, it's different. I'm still figuring it out, and different people are different. But one of the questions I try to ask people is it helpful to you? Do you want to have kind of group all your meetings and social times together and then have like a big amount of time in the afternoon most days where you can just code and not have to interact with people? And some people like that, and some people are like, nah, I'm fine, I'll figure it out. Like I'll just come in late and I'll work until 7 or whatever they do.
I have people in my company who wear headphones while walking around, not playing music, but just as a sign of no talk.
Yes.
It's just a culture thing.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
That's a definite culture thing that I think is permeated beyond. I mean, you see people walking down the street. You see, so.
And when I'm performing as a manager role, I always go with the agenda, fixed agenda, and also I'll put the outcomes like with the meeting, what we need to do, so that I can time it out for the meetings. But sometimes when I work for somebody else, then I'll always hate that because they don't even have the agenda. And finally, when they want to summarize, nothing is there actually at the end of the meeting, what actually they discussed.
That I agree
really
with,
hate
yeah.
that kind of meetings actually, because I'm used to so much with the agenda and also the outcome. But when I go with the random meetings like this, especially I don't like basically the Scrum approach at all. So the reason, because it's not that I'm liking the waterfall model, because here it's kind of too much of time wasters. And also the estimation is completely goes haywire. When you want to work on a fixed big project, I can definitely recommend the Scrum-based technology at all. Because if you're not sure about what you are building, then there's better not to build it. So
Well, I think
you can keep on advocating like do the trial and error, you'll never end up actually. It's kind of spinning the wheel, you are not moving anywhere. It's a kind of rocking chair.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, if you're building an airplane, I definitely would prefer you use waterfall and know what the requirements are to like stay in the air and things like that before you start building the displays and things. But I think that it depends how you implement it. I mean, to me, like people will be like, that's not how you do Scrum. I'm like, no, Scrum is what works for you. So when people get all up in arms about that's not Scrummy, is just like, that's not how you want to do Scrum, which is fine and legitimate, but that doesn't mean it's not Scrum. And so I feel like people get really, people have this idea like, I went through this training and this is what they said, but Scrum is what works for you.
So that being said, if you don't, you're not in 100% agreement with how your new company that you've joined does something, it could be the way that they're onboarding, it could be, you think there's improvement for the deployment pipeline. Do you have any advice for providing feedback or voicing your opinion in that?
So I think there's
in that new environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. So I think there's two ways. One is I don't like how this works, and I think it could be better if we did X, Y, Z, and I'm willing to help. So volunteering to help do something, I think, is a great way to offer feedback in a productive way. Like our pipeline, our deploys take too long. If we made these changes, if we broke things up so that we didn't have to do everything, it would be this much faster. That's great. Are you signing up to help do that? Awesome. That's a great
You're
conversation.
not just like complaining and making yourself look like, you know, the new guy who thinks he knows everything.
Yeah,
Right,
I've
yeah.
been to that situations because most of the times there's a lot of resistance from the veterans in that company. They think that they know everything because you are the newbie, so you don't know anything, so just get on board first. So that's kind of a discouragement, even though you have some point to say. But at least how you put it across to them actually to receive in a positive way, that's very challenging.
Maybe wait until your probationary
Yeah,
period
initially
is
they're
over.
simply
Yeah.
saying that no, you don't worry, so I'll take care of it. You don't know what is going on here, so you have a lot more things to play.
I guess it also speaks a lot for the company's culture and how accepted, you know, or how open they are to hearing
Exactly.
criticism, right?
Yeah, if they're open to embrace your ideas, definitely they'll at least make a note of it. Please put it in writing and I'll look at it later. That's a kind of positive way of response. You know, like when somebody, I've been experienced like saying, no, you are very new to this. You don't know the entire thing, stuff and all, so you only know this. Just wait for someone. By the time you wait, it's only been 1 year, so you'll still keep getting it.
Well, I think there's a balance. I mean, having somebody come on in like week 2 say, "This is stupid the way you do this,"
Right.
that's
Yeah,
not a
you don't
good
wanna do
look
that.
for any. Yeah, that's not going to go over well. And if all you do is complain about things but you don't have solutions, then that's not really good either. I mean, sometimes there's really good feedback like, oh, onboarding was good except for like you gave me the wrong directions and I went to the floor 24 instead of 27, so I was 30 minutes late. I mean, that's, you know, that kind of feedback you kind of have to give because, you know, but for things like why aren't you using this instead of that for your build, that kind of stuff, I think you need to temper with.
You need to inundate yourself with the culture a little further.
A little.
Research.
Exactly. You need to
Might be a
understand.
reason why they're not doing that, you know?
Right. I mean, I have a friend who works for the IRS, and we love to make fun of the IRS and like what version of Windows are they on, and you know how old is their but there are good reasons for that they make the decisions they make as far as security and so forth. I mean, there's a story behind it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying there's a story and there's a whole reason why they make the decisions they make, and that's important rather than. That's important to understand before you start talking about how you really need to move to something else.
I find asking, have we thought about?
Whoa, you're intimidating me with that eye contact.
Oh.
I thought if you come at it like, have we considered this instead of, hey, this is wrong, we could be doing it better this way. If you ask the question, they'll come back with, well, actually, we lose control of our entire Git repo and give it to Azure, so we don't want to do that for security reasons. Then I'm like, oh, okay.
That's a great answer.
I'm glad we mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Glad I didn't write a whole project and waste a day on it and then.
And you learn something from it. Absolutely. Exchange.
And then part of it too is like, what is the highest priority? Is the highest priority security? Is the highest priority performance? Is the highest priority 100% up? So all those things come into play for those decisions, and understanding what the priority order is really key. So, awesome.
Can we get your slides?
Yeah. I'm gonna put them up somehow.
Are they up and are they just going to be doing that or working that?
I haven't put them anywhere, but I will.
I would imagine it's on the website for now.
Yeah, I think they will try to share it in common place.
Yeah, I'll ask Pete.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm supposed to.